They say the night hides secrets, but here, the night reveals them. Welcome to Midnight Terror, where every shadow has a story, and every story has a scream. Turn off the lights and listen carefully. Mark, a man of logic and blueprints, found himself increasingly unsettled. He started meticulously checking the house each night, ensuring all windows were locked, doors bolted, and there were no drafts causing the strange movements. He even spent an afternoon inspecting the foundations and attic, finding nothing out of the ordinary, just the dust and decay expected of an old house. Yet the inexplicable persisted. Sarah, her artistic sensibilities now tinged with a growing anxiety, began to notice patterns. The lavender scent always seemed to precede a feeling of profound sadness that would wash over her in the conservatory. The creaking floorboard upstairs always sounded precisely 3 times, a slow, deliberate rhythm just before dawn. And the shadows Thomas pointed to seemed to lengthen and writhe in the dim evening light, almost as if they possessed a life of their own. One afternoon, Lily, usually a whirlwind of energy, became unusually quiet. Sarah found her in her room, staring intently at an antique music box they had found in the attic. It was intricately carved with scenes of dancing figures, but its mechanism was broken. "She wants me to listen," Lily whispered, her eyes wide and unfocused. "The lady. She says the music is sad." Sarah gently took the music box away, a prickle of unease running down her spine. That night, the creaking from upstairs was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just 3 creaks anymore. It was a series of heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth above their bedroom. Mark, his patience finally snapping, grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. Sarah waited at the bottom of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The upstairs hallway was cold, a stark contrast to the warm summer night. Mark swept the beam of his flashlight across the dusty floorboards, finding nothing but cobwebs and the faint tracks of their own feet. He checked each of the empty bedrooms, the silence amplifying the sound of his own breathing. There was nothing. Frustrated and unnerved, he returned downstairs. "Just the house settling," he said, his voice lacking conviction. But the following evening, the activity escalated. While they were having dinner, a loud crash echoed from the living room. They rushed in to find a heavy, antique portrait that had been hanging securely on the wall, lying shattered on the floor. There was no draft, no tremor, nothing to explain its fall. Thomas, pointing to a dark corner, whimpered, "The quiet men." They pushed it. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Mark's skepticism. He looked at Sarah, her face pale and etched with worry, and then at his children, their innocent eyes reflecting a fear no child should know. He knew then that this was more than just an old house with quirks. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. They started researching the history of the house. Days were spent in the local library, poring over old town records and newspaper archives. They discovered that the house had a tragic past. A family, the Ashworths, had lived there in the late 19th century. Their youngest daughter had died suddenly in the house, and shortly after, the mother had disappeared without a trace, leaving the father and older son to live out their days in quiet sorrow. The house had been sold several times since, each occupancy brief and marked by whispers of strange occurrences. The more they learned, the more a sense of dread settled over them. The whispering lady, the quiet men, the sadness in the conservatory, it all seemed to connect to the house's tragic history. They were living in a place touched by sorrow, perhaps even haunted by it. One particularly unsettling incident involved Thomas. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing lunch, while Thomas was playing quietly in the living room. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. Sarah raced into the living room to find Thomas huddled in a corner, his face white with terror, pointing at Barnaby the bear, which lay across the room, its button eyes seemingly staring blankly ahead. "Barnaby." He moved. Thomas sobbed. He was talking to the quiet men. Sarah held him tightly, trying to soothe his terror, but a shiver of genuine fear ran down her spine. She knew Thomas wouldn't make something like that up. Mark, now a reluctant believer, started looking for more concrete explanations. He consulted with a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had a reputation for being both knowledgeable and discreet. Eleanor visited the house, spending an entire evening conducting readings and taking measurements. Her findings were unsettling. She detected significant energy fluctuations in certain areas of the house, particularly Lily's bedroom, the conservatory, and the living room corner Thomas seemed so afraid of. She also noted a persistent feeling of sadness and unease throughout the property. "This house has experienced trauma," Eleanor said, her voice grave. "There are residual energies here, possibly even something more sentient." She suggested a cleansing ritual, a way to try and clear the negative energy and bring peace to the house. They agreed, desperate for any solution. Eleanor returned a few days later with various herbs, salts, and candles. The ritual took place at midnight, a hushed ceremony in the living room, the air thick with the scent of burning sage. For a few days, there was a noticeable lull in the strange occurrences. The house felt lighter, quieter. Mark and Sarah dared to hope that it had worked. But the reprieve was temporary. The activity slowly began to return, subtler at first, but with a growing intensity. Lily reported seeing the whispering lady more frequently, her sadness seemingly more palpable. Thomas became increasingly withdrawn, often found talking to the shadows in hushed tones. And Sarah in the conservatory felt the waves of sorrow more acutely, sometimes even hearing a faint melancholic humming that seemed to emanate from the very walls. One stormy night, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the flickering candles they had lit. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old house groan. Suddenly, a series of loud bangs echoed from upstairs, like someone was hammering on the floor. Lily screamed, and Thomas started to cry. Mark grabbed a flashlight, his hand trembling slightly. "Stay here," he told Sarah, his voice tight with fear. He ascended the creaking stairs, the darkness above feeling thick and oppressive. The banging stopped as he reached the top. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the hallway, finding nothing. He checked each room, the silence amplifying the sound of the storm. As he stood in the master bedroom, a gust of icy wind swept through the closed window, extinguishing his candle. He was plunged into absolute darkness. A cold whisper brushed past his ear, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, a sorrowful sigh that seemed to come from right behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing there. He stumbled back downstairs, his face pale and clammy. "There's nothing up there," he stammered, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. That night, they all huddled together in the living room, the storm raging outside mirroring the turmoil within the house. The banging returned, louder now, accompanied by scratching sounds coming from the walls. Lily started screaming, "She's angry. The lady is angry." Then the temperature in the room plummeted. They could see their breath misting in the air. A dark, shadowy figure began to coalesce in the corner of the room, the same corner Thomas always pointed to. It was tall and gaunt, its form indistinct but undeniably present. Two red eyes glowed menacingly in the darkness. Thomas, surprisingly, stopped crying. He pointed at the figure, his voice small but firm. "Go away," he said. "This is our house now." The shadowy figure seemed to flicker, its red eyes fixated on Thomas. A low growl emanated from it, a sound that vibrated through the very floorboards. Mark grabbed a heavy fireplace poker, his fear momentarily overridden by a fierce protectiveness for his children. Sarah held them close, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the antique music box on the mantelpiece, which had been silent for years, began to play. A faint melancholic melody filled the room, its notes thin and haunting. As the music played, the shadowy figure seemed to writhe, its form becoming less distinct. The red glow in its eyes dimmed. Lily, her fear replaced by a strange sense of calm, started to hum along with the music. Thomas, still pointing at the fading figure, repeated, "Go away. The music doesn't like you." As the music box wound down, its last notes fading into the storm's roar, the shadowy figure dissolved completely, leaving behind only a lingering chill in the air. The banging and scratching stopped. The oppressive darkness seemed to lift slightly. They stayed huddled together until dawn broke, painting the sky with pale hues of gray and pink. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile silence. The house felt different, quieter, almost subdued. Eleanor Vance returned the next day, sensing that something significant had occurred. They recounted the events of the previous night, the music box playing on its own, the disappearance of the shadowy figure. Eleanor looked thoughtful. "The music box," she said slowly. "It might be a key, an anchor to a different time, perhaps even a way to soothe whatever unrest resides here." They spent the next few days researching the Ashworth family further, focusing on the young daughter who had died in the house. They discovered that she had loved music, and her favorite toy had been a similar music box. Perhaps the sadness that permeated the house was tied to her unresolved grief. They started playing music in the house, soft, gentle melodies. They placed the antique music box in Lily's room. Slowly, subtly, the atmosphere began to change. The heavy sadness in the conservatory lessened. Lily stopped seeing the whispering lady as frequently, and when she did, the figure seemed less menacing, almost sorrowful. Thomas still spoke of the quiet men, but his fear had diminished, replaced by a quiet understanding. The house, it seemed, was responding to their efforts, as if the lingering sorrow was finally finding a release. But they knew, deep down, that the house held more secrets, and their story might not be over yet. The silence in the old Victorian was no longer oppressive, but it was still watchful, as if waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The house had a history, a pain, and perhaps a way of remembering and reminding. Our story ends, but the darkness never sleeps. If this nightmare thrilled you, leave a like before the lights go out. Subscribe for more tales that crawl out of the shadows. And don't forget to hit the bell. You never know when the next terror will strike. Until then, stay in the dark.